call it, but certainly it's not positive. It's definitely not a positive development. And I think sort of equating having more Americans killed with progress is somewhat dubious.
Well, tell me more about this mission to Kandahar, because the test case for the new surge, right? Forget everything you learned from the WikiLeaks dump, because that ends in December of 2009, and so none of that counts, because the real surge got underway and General McChrystal's night raid / beat cop strategy really got put into place after that. And so, but here we are at the beginning of September. We've had Marja, we've had the beginning of Kandahar. Help us understand exactly what's going on in those towns right now.
Well, I think one of the issues with Kandahar is just the sort of confusion surrounding what we're trying to accomplish there and what's actually possible to accomplish there. With General McChrystal, that was one of the main sort of criticisms of his command, was that they didn't really have a handle on what they were doing in Kandahar. Part of the problem is that on the one hand, you have military officials saying the war is going to be won or lost in Kandahar. And there's a question, well, is that true? And if so, what does it mean? You have local warlords who are allies. You have Taliban there, but the local warlords don't want to give up power. The Taliban don't want to give up power. So okay, what are we going to do? Now, what it looks like is that there's now these new Afghan surge troops. The Americans who've gone over there for the surge are going to be fighting in and around, mostly around Kandahar city, over the next few months. So look to that fighting to get pretty bad. But what's the idea? The idea is to sort of clear, hold, build. They call it a rising tide of security. It's the exact same language we heard from the Iraq surge. Now the question is, and I heard a pundit say this the other night, and I think this is true. He said the problem with Afghanistan is that you have the surge without the awakening, and the awakening meaning the Sunni awakening movement, where essentially we started paying off the guys we'd been fighting for a couple of years to get them to stop fighting us. The question is, can we kind of figure out that same kind of dynamic in Kandahar? And so far, I don't know if we can. And if you look at the people of Kandahar, one of the problems there was that we went down earlier this year and said, hey, Karzai and McChrystal did, and said, hey, we want to launch this operation here. Is that okay with the folks, so to speak? And the folks said, no way. We don't want your operation here. But we're trying to go ahead with it anyway, and that's going to be a real test case about whether Obama's strategy is going to work, or whether they can even convince us that it's working. Is probably more accurate.
I'm Scott Horton. Yeah, well, good point. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Michael Hastings. He is contributing editor of Rolling Stone magazine. And, when you talk about the Anbar awakening and whether that can be replicated in Afghanistan, I guess I can't really say this without oversimplifying it, but it sure seems to me that in Iraq, America was fighting, at least from, say, 2004 on, once Sistani called for a one-man, one-vote election, America was fighting on the side of the obvious winning side, of the majority, to expel the old minority out of the capital city. They succeeded in doing that. I guess the surge helped put the finishing touches on that. And the Sunni insurgency had been begging to become the awakening and the concerned local citizens for 6 years, 5 years, or 3 or 4 years at least, before Petraeus finally accepted their offer. And so that is the complete opposite of Afghanistan, where we're backing the losers. We're backing the KGB guys, the Northern Alliance, that has the support of I don't know what percentage of the population, but not enough to sustain it.
Yeah, the government has very little popular support, especially the local governments. They're viewed as corrupt and predatory, and there's a tendency to say, well, the Taliban can give us law and order. These warlords don't give us that. I think it's interesting. There's always this thing in military history about we're trying to always fight the last war. And we might be making that same mistake with Afghanistan this time around, in that if you look at the specific dynamics of what changed in Iraq, well, for one thing, we shouldn't pat ourselves, we shouldn't throw our arms out patting ourselves too much on the back about the surge. Remember, why did the Sunnis in Anbar eventually turn against al-Qaeda? Well, that's because we had invaded, totally destroyed their tribal structure, which allowed for this sort of power vacuum where, al-Qaeda-linked terrorists and other folks from the region sort of flooded in, they turned out to be even more brutal than the Americans. So the Sunni tribal leaders were like, well, geez, we got the Shiite government in Baghdad that's against us. We got these Al-Qaeda guys who aren't really doing what we want them to do, and we're fighting the Americans. So it was not a tenable situation. They had to figure out, just for their own survival, they had to make a deal. And the question is, are similar dynamics going to work in Afghanistan? I don't see those dynamics taking place right now. I think the sort of the Pashtun population is going to be much harder to convince to get on our side versus the sort of as you said, the marginalized Sunni tribal leaders.
Well, which is not to say that they would prefer to have Mullah Omar back in charge, is it?
No, yeah, I think that's I think that's right. And this gets to one of these other sort of points about the sort of glaringly obvious points about the sort of strategy that I sort of not enjoy pointing out, but just sort of point out. It's like, look, one of the major players in Kandahar, if not the major player, is Hamid Karzai's half brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai. The military, they call him AWK. If you're a real bad guy, you get a three-letter acronym. So AWK, he's linked. He's a CIA guy. He's linked to drug trafficking. He's linked to targeted killings, all these kinds of things. And there was a discussion throughout the year about whether or not AWK, we could work with him, or whether or not we should try to kill him. Now, this is our ally we're talking about, right?
Mm-hmm. So, Shades of DM in Vietnam.
Yeah, exactly. But the end game of our strategy is eventually we are going to negotiate with the Taliban. We are going to have to figure out a way to bring the Taliban into the government. So the question I always ask is, look, if we're having this much trouble deciding whether or not we want to deal with our ally, being AWK or Hamid Karzai, how are we going to feel when we actually have to negotiate with the Taliban? How is that really going to work? Is that palatable at all? And so we should go into this, if we can't negotiate, if we can barely, if we have to hold our nose to work with our ally, it's going to be much more difficult to finally negotiate with our enemy.
Well, Don Rumsfeld called it a long, hard slog. I guess we're just getting started. Thank you very much, Michael Hastings. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Scott. Appreciate it. Take care.
Everybody, Michael Hastings is contributing editor at Rolling Stone. We'll be right back with Andy Worthington after this.
It's Brazilian Day in L.A. on Sunday, September 12th from noon to 6 p.m. at the La Brea Tar Pits. Families and friends will spend an afternoon enjoying the best of Brazilian music, dance, and cuisine with a chance to win 2 round-trip tickets to Brazil. Live performances by Samba Ja, Muamba, Los Brazilian Boys, and Renny Flores. Again, that's Brazilian Day in L.A. on September 12th at the La Brea Tar Pits on Wilshire Boulevard between La Brea and Fairfax next to the L.A. County Museum of Art. More information available at 323-651-2664 or online at kpfk.org. KPFK is a proud media sponsor.
All right, y'all, welcome back. I'm Scott Horton from Antiwar.com. I'm filling in for Gustavo Arellano, who's off today. And I'm happy to welcome to the show Andy Worthington. His website is andyworthington.co.uk, and he's the author of the book, The Guantanamo Files, and is the producer of the movie, the documentary, Outside the Law, on the same subject there, the prison, the American prison down in Cuba. Welcome to the show, Andy. How are you?
Hey, Scott. Good to talk.
I'm very happy to have you here, and I really appreciate you staying up late. I know it's late in England right now.
It is. It's getting on for midnight here.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to talk to you, Scott. You know that.
Well, I appreciate that, and, it's not my fault that there are no Americans that do this work. That's why I need you.
Thank you.
Well, and I mean that because it is the comprehensive, incomparable, comprehensive study of the victims of the Guantanamo kangaroo process from 2001 on. And, the book is called The Guantanamo Files. Well, let's talk about some of these Guantanamo trials. What's the scorecard so far after years and years of pseudo-law down there at the Guantanamo Bay base in Cuba, Andy?
Oh, how many convictions have we had?
Yeah, and how bad of guys were these, and how many more can we get before the end of the year, and how wonderful is it all?
Well, it all seems to be grinding to a halt, actually, doesn't it, Scott? We've had four convictions in the military commission trial system at Guantanamo, one under President Obama. That was back in July when a man who had been a cook in a compound that Osama bin Laden sometimes stayed in accepted a secretive plea deal, and we still don't quite know what the terms of that are. He was given a 14-year sentence by the military jury, which also wasn't told what the deal was. So that looks like that's the cover to make it look like, the system's working, and all the stories behind the scenes are that he gets a couple of years. The administration avoids a messy court trial, the actual process of going through prosecuting the guy. And of course now they're stuck with Omar Khadr, which they should never have embarked upon in the first place. And reports in the media at the weekend are suggesting that there are no more trials set up that are in the pipeline for the imminent future. So, they're left with prosecuting a former juvenile prisoner, allegedly a child soldier, for war crimes that have been invented, and nothing else is going to happen until the midterm elections. I think everything's ground to a halt. No progress will be made on where to try Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the alleged co-conspirators for 9/11. Very few prisoners are being released. There's painfully slow progress as usual, but it is some kind of progress in the habeas petitions in the courts. It's pretty much ground to a halt, Scott. And, are the midterm elections going to make things any better? It doesn't seem to me that they are. If the Democrats lose some power there, as people are anticipating, then that puts the ball more back into the court of the Republicans, and they've been firing themselves up like crazy for the last 20 months, getting hysterical about how Guantanamo is full of terrorists when it's no such thing. So pretty gloomy, really.
Yeah, well, and that's really too bad, especially when you look back on how much so-called political capital Obama had when he took power and announced that he was going to close Guantanamo. He could have taken on those Republicans in Congress and won then, but he didn't put the effort into it, and now look at him.
Yeah, well, I mean, the behavior of Republicans and of a large number of Democrats is thoroughly reprehensible. But he has lacked the courage. This is a guy who, he does urbane, but he doesn't do shouting people down. And they're on these issues, on this cleaning up the mess. He's called it a mess. He knows it's a mess. Cleaning up what was left from the Bush administration. He hasn't stood up and shouted down his critics. And it seems to me the way that things are going with detention and with all the kind of war issues, really the Pentagon's leading. It doesn't seem to me as though he's in charge. And, why would we think that he is when his defense secretary, although clearly not a neocon and clearly not, a man like Don Rumsfeld, is a Republican? A Republican is running a Democratic president's Pentagon. Does it seem to you like he's in charge? It doesn't to me. And, and in the last couple of days, of course, we've had the end of combat operations in Iraq, which doesn't signify much.
I think the thing that bothers me is I don't think he minds that he's not in charge. I think might as well be George Bush up there. But in fact, there was a story, I think it was the New York Times, it was certainly highlighted by Glenn Greenwald over on his blog, where Obama's political advisors, and I don't think it was Rahm Emanuel, but it was one of the political advisor types from the White House, who went ahead and basically just plain admitted to the paper that, well, what we want to do is make it seem like we're trying to close Guantanamo so that that'll placate all the people of the world, but we're not really trying to. No big deal. They just admit it like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, if that is the case, then the problem with that is that nobody's looking into it closely enough. And that was certainly my impression with the review that was undertaken last year by the Guantanamo Review Task Force, which, was representatives of government departments and of the agencies. And, their overall approach was clearly erring on the side of extreme caution. I mean, it really was. It was a disappointment obviously a huge disappointment to the lawyers for these men who had hoped that there would be, an openness of mind, really, when Obama came in. And,